Okay, welcome back. This is a special edition of Russell Street Replay. We are previewing day 3 of the 2023 NFL Draft. Really excited to have Jared Pinder, one of my colleagues at the Russ Street Report, on the pod with me. Jared, how you doing today?
Man, it's been a long time since I've been on Russell Street Replay, but I am really happy I am back. It is a brand new year, brand new season. We are in late April, which only can mean one thing, Nikhil. It's draft season. And I am really excited about this draft season. I've been grinding a lot of tape. I'm sure you have too around these guys. And I'm really excited to getting into the portion of the draft that not a lot of fans might know about. And hopefully we can teach these fans and these listeners who might not know a lot about the day three guys something a little bit that they might not know.
Yeah. I think that's the interesting thing about day 3 is, there's such a massive pool of prospects for day 3 because there's hundreds. Because I think there's at least 150 or so picks on day 3, and there's probably double that number of prospects that could get drafted that are being considered by teams. And so really, even from, people like us who are really, really dialed in on the draft, it's hard to even, keep up with them all. The thing I want to start with today's podcast, though, we are recording this on Wednesday afternoon. And so this is as rumors swirl about a DeAndre Hopkins trade. There are rumors that the Chiefs and the Bills are still in, as well as the Ravens. There's a lot of rumors that the Ravens are close to getting a deal done. I've personally heard that the Chiefs are probably third in the rankings behind us and the Bills. I think it's closer to between the Ravens and the Bills than any other two teams right now. And I have to say that it would make a lot of sense for the offense. I think that the Ravens could try and trade back from 22 and get 34 in exchange for Hopkins, for example. I think it also depends on what the Cardinals end up doing with the number 3 pick. They want to trade out of it. They want to pick up extra picks. And if they're able to, that may change what their desired compensation is for Hopkins in terms of number of picks. They still will have him at the same value, of course, but they might be looking for only one pick in return or a pick swap in return to upgrade one of their picks rather than trying to amass picks by trading him. We'll see how this plays out. I definitely, wouldn't hate the acquisition. There would be obviously cap numbers, Lamar Jackson contract stuff to work out. But this would be a big move. This would be the second, kind of massive move that DaCosta has made in the span of a month right before the draft, and really put the Ravens in a really good position to just tick off the best players on their board in this draft after really rounding out their offense. They wouldn't need to draft a receiver at this point, adding Hopkins. Cornerback is still a need, but I still think there's a lot of confidence that this defense can add a veteran cornerback to start if needed. So just your quick thoughts on the Hopkins rumors before we get into our day 3 prospects.
Yeah, man. Hopkins is a player that they've been going after for a little bit. It goes back to 2020. Unfortunately, apparently they did have a deal in place to get Hopkins. Unfortunately, our good friend, the butt chin, Bill O'Brien, said no. They don't want to send him to a AFC opponent. If you remember, the Ravens did play the Chiefs in 2020. They did not want to see that, so they sent him to Arizona. At the time, it was considered to be one of the biggest steals of all time,
Mm-hmm.
getting DeAndre Hopkins for a second round pick and David Johnson. But now I think it's funny how now we go back and 3 years ago that was considered to be the worst trade of all time, and now this year he might get traded for even less, and now it's just like that's just it's too much to give up a second round pick. It's just funny how the NFL cycle just goes through players. But obviously Hopkins would add a lot to the Ravens room. They already have Odell, they have Rashad Bateman. They do need that. To me, I think that third wide receiving piece really completes that defense. Build that basketball team in terms of like what you want to do on I say defense. I meant offense. So obviously the stuff about like the draft compensation and the cap move, there's a lot of moving parts, which is the reason why I don't think it's happened yet. It's because teams want to see what's on the board. Teams want to see, okay, well, if Hopkins is costs this much, it's a very deep wide receiving class, as we'll get into. Why should I give up this when I can just get this wide receiver this late? And that's probably why the Bills, Chiefs, Ravens have always been in rumors, but it's never really gotten done until right now when the rumors are swirling because teams want to see what's available. Teams want to keep their options open. And
Yeah, I mean, when you're thinking about trading a pick, right? That's a theoretical player. If you don't know who that is, you have a value assigned to the pick, but the player that you might get at that pick might be even more valuable to you than the pick itself. And so that's why, I'd be surprised if this went down before, really honestly, before the draft started. I think that the Ravens and the Cards kept it under wraps as best as they could last year. I still think the Hollywood trade leaked, and that's why the Saints traded up to take Chris Olave. I think that was one of the Ravens' primary targets at 14. But I think that being able to keep it mostly under wraps, and certainly under wraps from the public last year, I think is what you'd expect to see again this year. Both if it's the Bills or it's the Ravens. I think the Chiefs, I guess you could still consider them a dark horse, as well as the Giants. I think there was a report earlier today. And so I think it's one of those things where we'll know when we know, if we know. Certainly an exciting prospect, but I think that the devil certainly is in the details, like you were saying, with all the moving parts. Moving on to day 3 of the draft, which is what we're focusing on today. I just want to kind of go through all the different positions the Ravens are looking at. We know they're prioritizing most likely wide receiver and cornerback, although if a Hopkins trade happens, it's, really cornerback is their tier 1 biggest need. And just kind of go through some of the day 3 prospects that we included in our roundtable rankings. So let's take a look at receiver first. A lot of big targets. It looks like what our panel was looking for. Our analyst at RSReplay report really wanted a big receiver, contested catch skills, which makes sense given those team struggles in the red zone, and given their current receiving roster, which I believe only has one player taller than 6 feet right now, and that's Michael Thomas, basically a camp body. And so I think adding a big receiver has got to be a priority in this draft. I personally put down Andre Osivas, who, he's the track runner from Princeton. He is fairly raw as a route runner, as a football player in general. But when you see his just pure speed and pure ability at the catch point, I think that those are two immediately translatable skills that Todd Monken can kind of go to work with early on in Osivas's NFL career. Even if he doesn't develop into kind of an elite, route runner, I think that's going to be hard given his profile. But he could become a speedster that contributes to this offense, make some plays in the red zone. And if we have to move on from Devin Duvernay, he's even the kind of guy that I would love to train up in the return game and just use his natural speed there as well.
Yeah, Andre Isaias is a really, really fun player. He reminds me a lot of Marcus Valdez-Scantling, former Packers receiver, current Chiefs receiver. Small school guy, pretty tall, runs really fast. Tested out of the gym. He put up a 9.95 RES score according to Math Bomb. Really, really fun Twitter follow if you know. Um, like you mentioned, he put up really good numbers. He was a Senior Bowl standout. He is very raw in route running. The hands I think are pretty good. Like I do think they could be a little bit better, but he does use his size, does use his speed very well. Again, it's sort of hard to get a read when he's playing at such a small school in Princeton.
Mm-hmm.
But this, I like, we're going to mention multiple times. Day 3 is when you take the risk on the athletes. This is when you take the dart throws. And this is where I think the Ravens have gotten in trouble in day 3 is that they're valuing the production of the day 3 guys rather than the potential of the day 3 guys.
Mm.
Like the biggest one to me was Dalen Hayes, the edge rusher from Notre Dame. Just had a pretty decent career at Notre Dame, just never did anything in the NFL, was just not a good athlete at all. He was just pretty slow, decent power rusher, but like he was another day 3 guy that like they thought could be something, and he just wasn't. He was the exact opposite of betting on the traits.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, I think that's a great pick. I am going to go in a little bit different direction for my guy. My guy was Jaden Reed out of Michigan State. Reed is a very fascinating watch to me, Nikhil. He is around 6 foot, but he plays like 6'4", which is why I think I liked him so much. Because I think while he's not the biggest guy in the world, he just dominates on those go balls. He dominates on those 50-50 chances. He was a touchdown hawk at Michigan State. He's a red zone target. I think one of the reasons why the Ravens have had such issues scoring is because they don't have a red zone target outside of Mark Andrews. Like we saw it multiple times. Like it's like where was Lamar Jackson going to go to in some of these plays? Like he's not throwing a go ball to like tiny ass like Hollywood Brown. He's not throwing a go ball to Demarcus Robinson who has trouble catching. So it's like he would be like the to me, he's the type of like chance you take in the late rounds.
Yeah, and I think that I liked Reed. I watched a few of his games. Definitely the kind of tough eval because of the offense at Michigan State. Not a well-rounded offense, not a very good offense in general, and so he was really the only playmaker, and you could see when he was making plays, but you could also see how there was little space opened up for him to do a lot more. So I think he did a lot with what he could. I like Reed. I think I say this a lot. My biggest thing about receivers have two jobs more than any other. It's to get open and make catches. Getting yards after the catch. Getting yards after the catch is great. Run blocking is great. Being able to, chase down deep balls like Hollywood is great. But at the end of the day, you have to get open so your quarterback can throw you the ball. And when he does, you got to catch it. And I think that Reed fits that mold of a guy who just pretty sharp route runner, isn't the biggest, like you said, but knows how to play big. Wouldn't hate this as a day 3 pick. I've heard some people saying that he should go as early as day 2. So this would definitely be a solid value pick on day 3. Moving on to cornerback, this is an interesting spot for the Ravens, in my opinion, because they don't really have a second outside cornerback or a clear starting slot cornerback right now. And like I said earlier, I think it's very easy, especially with how talented this defense is, to sign a free agent cornerback right now. There's still Kyle Fuller from last year. There's Shaquille Griffin. Marcus Peters is still out there. I know they had a visit with Rock Ya-Sin. Those are all options, but none of them are on the team. And beyond that, cornerback 2 right now is Brandon Stevens. And I am maybe a founding member of Brandon Stevens' Hive. I love the guy. I think he has improved tremendously after having to. This has always been remarkable for me. Switch from, I believe, running back to wide receiver briefly to cornerback in college, switched to safety as a rookie in the pros, and then back to cornerback in his second year. And by the end of last year, he looked really good again in those 2 games against the Bengals towards the end of the season. So, he's a 3rd-round pick. Third round pick starting outside cornerback in his 3rd year would not be, out of the question. It's just maybe it's not ideal, but I think then you could focus on more of a slot guy, a slot only guy in the draft. That being said, I think there's a really interesting mix of players available on day 3. They have a few of the, prototypical big, long Ravens outside cornerbacks like Corey Trice, who Adam Bonacorsi went with. I even like Q Blue Kelly from Stanford. He's also like one of those long, rangy outside press man cornerbacks that Baltimore likes. But you went in a little different direction with Jacorian Bennett. So why don't you explain to me, what that pick was and why you like him?
Yeah, Jacorian Bennett is the second corner from Maryland. The other one is Deontay Banks, which obviously a lot of Ravens fans want. But Bennett is to me like a little bit different than Banks. I like the versatility of the Maryland corners. They play a lot of zone, play a lot of man. I think that's something that Mike McDonald really values is the versatility in his DBs. Whether you can play slot, play outside, do man, play zone. It's they like versatile pieces like that. Bennett to me it was super impressive at the combine. Ran a really good 40. Tested out the gym. He's built pretty well. A little bit like big, strong. Like he's the type of dude that you take again, like another one of these, like the shot in the dark, because that's really what you're looking for at this point. Is that like you're looking for guys that like you can develop. You're not really looking for a day 3 guy that like you need to make an impact, and that's kind of what can make like teams get into a little bit of a trouble is that you're expecting day 3 guys to make big impacts. And for me, I think Jacorian Bennett would be a really fun developmental pick, and that's why I think I really like it. He's the athlete. His tape was a little underwhelming. He didn't make a lot of plays on the football, even though they were. He left a lot of meat on the bone, which I think is the biggest problem with me. I don't like when corners leave a lot of meat on the bone in terms of plays. If you have a chance to make an interception, make that interception. If you have a chance to break the ball up, like it's like go hunt, be that playmaker. And I think that was like my biggest problem with him. But again, we're in day 3, so that's really where we're like that's my only really big like concern for him.
Yeah, and I think that's something people talked about with Deontay Banks, his Maryland teammate. Didn't turn his head around quick enough and make plays on the ball, which I didn't really find to be as much of an issue in his film, like as you're saying, as Bennett. To me, that is something that can be developed in the NFL. And what you can't develop is Bennett's athletic profile. I think he could be a contributor on special teams too. So I really like that pick. I don't know how I don't know. Like he's definitely a day 3 prospect. He's definitely more of a developmental guy. And I think with Blue Kelly, I think he's such a good fit for the Ravens and has the experience that I think he could be. I'm not starting him over Brandon Stevens as a rookie. Don't get me wrong, but I think I'd feel better about Blue Kelly hopping into a major role as a rookie than I did about, for example, Jalen Armour Davis last year. Just because Blue Kelly is just such a good outside press man. Cornerback that I think you could stick him in that role. You'd have to protect him a little bit on in breaking routes. He's not as sharp crossing the field as he is walling guys up off the sideline. But his tape is solid, and I think that is kind of an interesting player to see fall into day 3 where he has very clear limitations. He isn't much of a factor in the run game, but again, when you're talking about a rookie who may need to step up into a bigger role in a what is not a super thin cornerback room, but certainly not one that's full of starting level talent. He's the kind of guy that I wouldn't hate adding to this team and say, look, it's week 8, someone picked up a hamstring injury. We need you to just get in there and block down someone on the outside and just, prevent anyone from getting over the top, give him specific roles, give him specific responsibilities. And I think that he can excel there, especially, given that he's a press man cornerback and that's what the Ravens love. Moving on to offensive line here, we can look at the offensive line. I think that article is going up today, and we can talk about those picks. They'll be published by the time we post this up on YouTube. I think that the Ravens have a little bit of a tendency, and we'll see if they continue this, to kind of wait until day 3 for their offensive linemen, partially for positional value and partially because of their history of developing them. And I'd say the same for defensive linemen, although I think that, obviously edge is a greater positional value. But on the interior, they also tend to wait until day 3 to make those picks. It works for them this year, I think, because starting left guard is still a little bit of a question mark, but otherwise they're set at their 4 other positions. And so they're really looking for, I think they need a backup center. There are only 2 guys who can snap the ball in Baltimore right now. That's Tyler Linderbaum and Patrick McCurry. Tristan Colon went to the Giants, and obviously Ben Powers got that big deal with the Broncos, and he was the emergency center last year. So they need someone that can snap the ball. And that is, as we know in Baltimore, that is not actually that common of a skill. We've had haven't had that many like undrafted guys other than Cologne rotate through that can snap a ball competently. And so that was something I was really looking for when I went with Olusegun Oluwatimi from Michigan. He didn't jump off the screen when I was watching him. Definitely was not a guy where I was like, oh, there's a future starting center. But I definitely see him as a guy that you can have as a backup right away. He's getting a little bit pegged as a center only prospect, but and again, I don't know him or anyone at Michigan personally, but the reports about his work ethic and his attitude, his ability to anchor the middle of the line makes me think that he can develop in Baltimore, especially a Baltimore offensive line that has shown a knack for developing late round offensive linemen into starters at center or guard. Bozeman came out of Alabama, center, was pretty quickly developed into a guard, very easily moved back to center when he was needed to. So, I think that, I like Oluwatimi. I think I have a little bit of that Michigan bias that the Castle has too. But it was the best offensive line in the middle of the year, and he was the one anchoring it. I don't think that anyone else from that offensive line is expected to go much higher than him, and this year or next year. And so I think that he's just, an excellent all-around prospect to add on day 3.
Yeah. Again, another Michigan connection. That'll be another Michigan guy. Obviously McDonald and Harbaugh brothers. Obviously, if there is anybody who's going to know more about Olutimi, it's going to be John Harbaugh. Like John's going to talk to Jim. He's going to say, "Look, this guy a really hard worker." Like John will know everything he needs to know about every single Michigan prospect in this draft because he has the inside connection with Jim. And I liked him. I thought he was a really solid prospect. Was not a good tester. I think people were really waiting for like him to, like, to put up like monstrous numbers in the testing game. Didn't have the best Senior Bowl, but is a very good player when you look on the film. He's a reliable pass blocker. He's a really good run run blocker. He sort of does, I guess he kind of does remind me of what Ben Powers was coming out of Oklahoma a couple years ago. He'd follow the Ben Powers track of getting to sit for like a year or two, and then developing, and then finally has that one breakout season, and then eventually they leave. So I really like him. I think he's pretty solid. I would not be mad at all if if he's one of our day 3 picks. I don't think you can really get mad at that. Plus, he's so versatile. He can play a lot of different positions. He's a really fun player. For me, Nikhil, I had to take the easy layup. I saw it. I had opening to the hoop, and I slammed it down. It's Chandler Zavala. I'm not even sure he's going to be available at day 3 because it seems like every single NFL fan base on Twitter, on draft media, on any kind of like insider loves this dude. I'm not even sure he's going to be able to get it to day 3. But I'm telling you what, he is so much fun to watch, Nikhil. He is a really, really, really good run blocker. He gets down there, he plays dirty, he'll bow those guys out of the way. Um, the pass block is definitely a he's a good pass blocker, but I do think he does need to get a little bit better. I think his feet were just a little bit slow, but I think you can improve feet speed. I think you can improve that. I think it's actually harder, Nikhil. I think it's going to be a take. I think it's harder to improve hand speed than it is foot speed. I can improve foot speed. Hand speed's a little bit different because I think hand speed's much more about placement, much more about where you go. So I think it's definitely a little bit harder. So I think Chandler Zavala is just that. If he's there in the 4th round, Ravens are going to run this pickup. They're gonna do whatever it takes. To me, in my opinion, to get him if he's available in the 4th. I remember it would be very similar to when Daniel Faalele went to the Ravens in the 4th round last year. Because I'm like he's available in the 4th round. There's no way they're passing him up. And the very first pick on day 3 was Faalele. He'd be a very similar situation.
Yeah, I like Zavala too. I agree that the main drawback with thinking about him is just if he's going to be available on day 4. That being said, I think he's one of those late risers in this draft class that I think because a lot of people, or at least in the public, were kind of late to the game in terms of putting him up there as a top guard prospect, that he might kind of catch that wave up all the way up into day 2, where I don't know, I'm not sure I'd necessarily put him as a solid day 2 player. I think he's more on the line between day 2 and 3 for me. And so if he catches that wave up from day 3 into day 2, he just keeps his momentum. I could definitely see him going earlier, but a great pick in the 4th or 5th round if he's there. Moving on to defensive line, other side of the trenches. This is an interesting need for the Ravens, I think, because you could say that they probably could stand to add a player at any of the positions across the defensive line, from your edge rusher all the way into your nose tackle. They could stand to add a player at pretty much any of those spots. I think the most clear spot is a 3 technique. Losing Calais Campbell, you don't have Jason Pierre-Paul or Justin Houston, who could slide inside every now and then. And I think that probably that's going to feel like the biggest defensive line need. I think edge rusher, they have Owe, Ojabo, and Bowser. That's 3 solid edge rushers. I don't know if any of them are elite guys, but I'm not sure that edge rusher is as a top of need as everyone thinks when, we don't know who's going to be manning the middle. Calais Campbell's gone. I think a Justin Houston reunion is definitely, possible. And that would make it seem like, your 3 or 5 tech defensive lineman is more of a need. That's why I went with Moro Ojoma out of Texas. There are a lot of tweeners in this class. There's Carl Brooks. There's Mike Morris. There's a lot of tweeners on day 3 defensive linemen. That's not a Jomo. He's a pure 3 tech. That's where he'll play in the NFL. He's got a lot of length, a lot of strength that he'll try to use to bull rush pockets early on, but he'll need to develop some other moves. The reason I'm okay with that is that we've got Anthony Weaver, in my opinion, one of the best defensive line coaches in the game right now, does a really good job of training up these, physical, athletic prospects into solid contributors. And Ojomo is going to be an impact player on rundowns right away. I think he'll look like he'll look like Justin Madubuike pretty early on, I think, with his ability to shed blocks and just win in the run game. I think the ceiling is even higher if he can figure out pass rushing, as it is for a lot of interior defensive linemen. But if there's a place that I would want him to develop that game, it's with Anthony Weaver in Baltimore.
Yeah, he's a pretty fun player to watch on tape, man. Really underrated player. I'm surprised he's not getting a little bit more buzz, just because he has such a high floor as a really good run stopping three tech. As unvaluable as some fans think that is, the NFL does value that. Like it's like there is a role for that, and I'm surprised he's not getting a lot of love. He's a really fun player. Again, he's a bit of a tweener, like you mentioned. There's a lot of tweeners in this class. Um, Joe, but I think what gives Ojomo the edge over those guys is his age. He's only 21, and you have a lot of time to grow to the point where if you can get that pass rush up, he's going to be after 2 years of development, what 23, and like that's when he's so young. That's when like I think that's the edge that he has over these other guys is that I think he's a lot younger than a Carl Brooks. I think he's a lot younger than like a lot of other players, and I think he's a really fun player to watch. Really fun pick there. I would not complain at all if that's the pick in the fourth round. For me, I went with a little bit more. I went with a little bit of a different direction. I went for pass rush over run stopping. I went with Yaya Diaby out of Louisville. When you
Mm.
watch his tape, it is so much fun to watch. He's such a bendy firecracker off that edge. He's so fast. When he gets off that line, it is explosive as anything. He is very rough around the edges, though. He has great athleticism. He has he basically just I don't know, man. It's like he's just so much fun to watch. He's shorter. He's doesn't really have the longest of arms, which is the reason why he's in this tier right now. If he had longer arms and he was a little bit younger, I think he'd be a no doubt day two pick. He'd be in that range with Felix Anduke Uzama and Bijo Jalari and even like a guy like an Andre Carter the second out of Army, he'd be in that range. But the reason why he's on that range is because just, he does have a lack of physical. He does have like physical limitations, which unfortunately you can't teach. So I think that is like the one big flaw for him. But if he's available in like the fourth or the fifth, even if he falls out of the whole entire draft process in general, and if he's a UDFA, I don't expect that. But if he is, this would be a really fun pickup for the Ravens.
Yeah, and I think as you were saying before, betting on production has been something they've done in the past, but it really feels like their successes late in the draft have really come from getting these tradesy guys who they coach up. They've had good defensive coordinators for the past several years, and whether it's Wink, Pagano was one of our defensive coordinators. We had, and of course Mike McDonald right now, and just give them these guys that have traits to work with that they can then scheme stuff up for, kind of like, and I think Mike McDonald designs his defense kind of like an offense in a way. To me, he uses weapons. He tries to attack the offense instead of just defending against them, and I think that Diaby would be a really good contribution to that. He'd be a piece that McDonald can kind of deploy as a weapon instead of just saying, okay, go set the edge, go hold, don't just hold, attack. And that's kind of McDonald's mentality when it comes to his defensive coaching. Moving on to day three quarterbacks. This one, I think we went with the same pick here. Dorian Thompson-Robinson. He to me is just the definition of a backup quarterback for Lamar Jackson. He's got great physical tools. He's got plenty of speed, obviously, but a really surprisingly good arm. I compare his arm favorably to like all of the day three quarterbacks in this class. And I also think that toughness attitude that we love in Tyler Huntley really shows up on the field. I think I first took note of DTR really as a favorite, day three target of mine when I saw him lead blocking for Zach Charbonnet on a lot of the UCLA film I would watch. And, Charbonnet has, whether it's designed or, Charbonnet just has the agility to cut back and kind of reverse field. And Robinson would be out there plowing into linebackers, linemen, whatever, to just get a block off and open up some space for his running back. And I like that, not just because of the attitude that it shows, but also because that's the kind of thing that you need from your backup quarterback. If your backup quarterback's in the game, that means something has gone wrong with your starting quarterback. And you're going to need every little bit that you can get because the margins get so much slimmer. So when he's willing to do the things like run block, that makes a huge difference. He's the kind of guy that chases down the defender if he gets intercepted because he won't let it turn to a pick six. That being said, his ball security, something that needs to be coached up. His confidence when it comes to ripping throws, I love, but again, something that's going to have to be tempered a little bit. Something I'd definitely rather have to rein in the pros is a guy's confidence to rip throws into tough windows than to have to, convince him that he can do it. So I love the attitude and just the overall skill set that he brings to the Ravens as really an ideal backup for Lamar in this kind of offense.
Yeah, me and you both had the same pick. DTR is a very fun player to watch. Like you mentioned, I think you really hammered in a lot of um his uh his strengths and weaknesses. To me, I think he's a very spitting image of Tyler Huntley coming out of Utah. He's literally, to me, I think he's almost the same kind of prospect. He has a great arm, very underrated arm. He's a great athlete. He ran a really good 40. Obviously, I think Stetson Bennett will be the popular pick here by many Ravens fans due to the Georgia connections with Todd Monken. To me, I think this late in the draft, I think again, bet on the athleticism, like bet on the freak of nature that needs to develop his accuracy and his touch. But like you said, I think he's a very rah team guy. I think teams are gonna love that about him. Like you mentioned, the blocks, like going out and blocking for your running back, not usually something you see from a quarterback, but he does it. It's on film. Um, I can definitely see him being, if he makes it through the draft process, he will be one of the most coveted UDFAs out of all of these guys. He will be very similar to Carson Strong in last year's draft cycle, where I think Strong was just signed immediately after the draft started. If he makes it through the process, he will be the first guy to get calls. I'm telling you what, right now, people are going to come after him if he makes it out of the draft. Out of the draft, he would be a great backup for the Ravens.
Yeah, well, and I think that's why I just don't see him making out of the draft because I think teams are starting to understand that, not just having a backup is important, but having a high floor backup that you can, kind of design a different offense around, even if he isn't playing for an Eagles or a Ravens or a Bears where, he can step right into a dual threat offense for his skill set. He's also like, he just brings a high floor with his rushing ability as a backup. You like, that's exactly what you want in a backup. And so, I think DTR would be a great pick on day three. I also think there's kind of the politics involved in it. You don't like, I think picking Hendon Hooker for the Ravens would just be a mistake in a lot of ways. I think it would pretty much, it would be either a waste of a pick or it would torpedo your chances of keeping Lamar and reduce your leverage if you tried to deal Lamar, maybe next offseason. It would hurt your relationship with Lamar by drafting who appears to be a clear successor instead of drafting a guy who you say, Lamar, this is your backup. Like, this is your understudy. And as long as you're here, it's going to be hard. It's going to be pretty much impossible for him to break out of that role. Whereas if Lamar gets hurt, Hooker takes over and, explodes, who knows what happens. So with DTR, it's more, you draft a backup, you have him fill that role, and yeah, you don't rock the boat too much. And I think that's important. Finally, we'll talk about our wild card. And this has been a bit of a fun one over at Rush Street Report, just to come up with different guys that, they're not edge rushers, they're not wide receivers or cornerbacks, they're not like the most, positionally value or highly touted prospects, especially given, the Ravens' lack of draft picks. You really expect them to go after need-based players. But you could argue that there's a need across, different positions. I think the only one where there's a clear lack of need is tight end. We have three guys I'm pretty comfortable with at tight end plus Patrick Ricard. That being said, Chuck Clark's departure, we don't have a, really experienced safety in the defensive back room anymore, especially a guy who might be able to drop down and play slot like Chuck Clark did. Running back, there's no running backs on the roster after, other than Justice Hill after next year. Both, Dobbins is kind of expected to move on because I don't see the Ravens paying him a big market level contract. And it seems like Gus Edwards' deal would have been an extension if the Ravens had intended to keep him much past this year. Instead, they just restructured his deal to include void years and reduce his cap hit this year. And of course, at linebacker, the Ravens may or may not pick up Patrick Queen's fifth-year option. They have, Josh Ross, Malik Harrison, but they don't really have a long-term running mate for Roquan Smith as it stands. And I don't think that's going to be Patrick Queen just because of the money involved in paying, two starting caliber inside linebackers. So, it's thinking about needs a year, 2 years out, which is something that I think NFL teams take into account more than fans do. Typically, when they're thinking about the draft, is especially on day 3, you're not going to get a guy who's going to contribute, who's going to be a major contributor year 1. He might be a rotational guy, he might contribute on special teams, but not much beyond that. Whereas when you look at a day 3 guy 2-3 years out from his draft night, then you're starting to think about, okay, how could this guy really be an important player for my team? So you want to start off by telling me who you went with for wild card, and then I'll give you some other options that I thought of.
Yeah. To me, the wild card, I went with running back in the day 3. I think day 3 running backs are really easy to find. We've seen guys like Isaiah Pacheco for the Chiefs last year go. We've seen other guys like that. And you mentioned how Gus Edwards might not be here long. Well, Nikhil, what if I told you could get Gus Edwards in the 7th round? That to me is Chris Rodriguez Jr. out of Kentucky. He's a really solid running back, man. He gives me Gus Edwards vibes. He's a very, very powerful runner with that really good lower half. He runs through tackles. He'll take somebody to the ground. He'll throw in a nice stiff arm. To me, I think he would be the exact opposite of Tyler Beatty last year. The Ravens tried their hands at taking a little smaller receiving running back. It didn't work out. For some reason, he didn't gel with the rest of the coaching staff for some reason. Got picked up by Denver, but this this would basically be like the inverse of that. Like this would be classic Ravens, powerful, strong running back late to eventually become a very good backup. This would be the Gus Edwards replacement for me.
Yeah, I like that pick. I like Rodriguez as, just that late round power back that you're just fairly comfortable giving him the ball. And I think what I'm looking for in day 3 in day 3 running backs is guys that I'm just comfortable giving the ball in really in short yardage situations to just grind out 2 to 3 yards, because at a minimum, that's what you like. You want to minimize negatives on run plays, and I think Rodriguez is the kind of guy that it's just really tough to bring him down in the backfield, like Gus Edwards. He's not super shifty, but he's got enough of that first cut ability, like Edwards does, to make a guy miss in the backfield and just keep losses from accumulating in the run game. My pick for wild card, I think I'm going to go with Owen Pappoe out of Auburn. He's small. I'll preface this with that. He's right around 6 foot. He's about 220 pounds. He's not like a big mauler linebacker, but he's fast. His speed score from his 40-yard dash is 4.3940 for a linebacker at 225, which is incredible. He's explosive. I think he'd be and he's got a really good coverage grade. I think that he, interestingly, because of his size, doesn't really profile as a stack and shed run stopping kind of inside linebacker. To me, he profiles a little bit more of a Chris Board kind of guy, a guy who you're comfortable putting in on passing downs and who will dominate on special teams with his speed and his work ethic. So I'm a big fan of his. I think watching some of his tape, you can tell that his size is an issue. His strength is not. He actually, I know bench press isn't the end all be all for strength at the combine, but he did have 29 bench reps. And that's as a relatively smaller player, relatively shorter arms than most guys you're looking at in the middle of the field. Kind of a guy, I see, again, this is not like he can be as good as Roquan Smith. It's just the first name I thought of. Kind of similar to how Roquan is really good at sifting through traffic instead of blowing through guys to make plays. I kind of see that for Pappoe. I think he'll contribute on special teams right away with that ability to move through traffic. And if he can become somewhat of a coverage guy in the pros as kind of a sub linebacker, a nickel backer, maybe, I think that would be a fantastic kind of place for him to land in Baltimore. Again, a guy that Mike McDonald can use not just as a defender, but as a weapon to attack other teams' offenses.
Yeah. Papo's a really interesting player. I think he's really interesting compared to the other kind of smaller running linebacker in this class to Evon Pace Jr. from Cincinnati. I think both of them are kind of like a little bit different, similar a little bit different play styles. I think Pace is a little bit of a better run defender, but I think Papo's the better coverage player. Again, Papo, my issue with him is that he just gets annihilated in the run, which I think is kind of like not the world's biggest problem if we are so late, but I just do wonder how the Ravens do feel about that. We know that the Ravens are a little bit more old school when it comes to valuing run defense in terms of from their front seven players. He would be a really fun pickup. Again, he'd be a very similar to John to kind of
Josh
like
Ross.
yeah, Josh Ross, like
Mhm.
Chris Board, like very similar, like it's like players to them. um, I certainly wouldn't hate it. I understand the need for a linebacker. I just some of the linebackers in this class, Nikhil, just don't really necessarily wet my whistle. I would more so like see. I know this might sound crazy, but if Patrick Queen really is too expensive and we have to trade him, would it really be the worst thing in the world to give Malik Harrison starting reps next to Roquan Smith?
No, I mean, I think Harrison looked quite good next to Roquan last year, but I think you run into the same issue with him as you do with Queen, which is that he's going into the last year of his contract. And so, Queen, I think the Ravens have until early May, I think, to pick up his fifth-year option. Not sure if they're going to do that. It is, it's not a really expensive. I don't think it's projected to be especially expensive in general, but it's still paying a lot for a guy who's your second inside linebacker behind a guy you're already paying $20 million a year to. I think Queen would probably cost more on his fifth-year option in that year than Roquan would against the cap. And so you run into that same issue with Malik Harrison. Again, I'd love to give him the reps, but the thing is, if he really overperforms, he could go get a contract elsewhere, kind of like Ben Powers did in his main year as a starter. That's why I could see them taking a shot on a guy late. D Winters, I think, is another that visited Baltimore and apparently had a really good meeting with him very early in the draft process. And could be like another special teams linebacker two that they kind of develop into a linebacker two who contributes early on special teams. They had another meeting with, and I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but another linebacker who looks like he's projected, Amari Burney out of Florida, who a bit bigger, looks like he's a bit projected to go linebacker, but he is, definitely a hybrid safety linebacker guy. He's a bit bigger than Papo, but has a little bit more of a safety profile. Definitely, like if you're thinking like Tony Jefferson, Anthony Levine, those guys who were called safeties but really played linebacker most of their career. I could see the Ravens going after one of those players as well to try and just again boost the coverage chops in a linebacker core, because you're really confident in how you feel about stopping the run with that front seven as it stands.
Yeah, yeah,
I
totally.
think this pretty much brings us to the end of our day three prospects, unless there's anyone else specific that you want to add. I think it's worth mentioning, the Ravens have they have just 3 day 3 picks. They have a fourth rounder, a fifth, and a seventh rounder, and a sixth rounder this year. That I think was the result of a pick swap last year, 2 years ago. It's not a lot of picks. They're going to have to really prioritize what positions need fit, something that I think they struggled with in past years. I think they did a really good job balancing those things last year, but yeah, I think it's also going to be a question of who falls there. What guys do you expect to go on day 2 that are available day 3? And all of a sudden, if a situation happens where, a Daniel Falele falls to you in the 4th round, do you take that or do you stick with who you plan to take originally? The Ravens tend to go with the best player available. And so I'd expect to see that continue on Saturday. Any final thoughts on the day 3 prospect class, Jared?
Not particularly. I think I've spoken on my trips about this class. I will say if you're looking for value later, I would look at 2 positions. I would look at the wide receiver and the corner positions. This is really where you can find value. Ironically, it's the 2 Ravens' biggest needs.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe that plays into the DeAndre Hopkins trade again. It's like we go back and forth. We go back to the DeAndre Hopkins trade. It's like, well, if they are giving up number 22 in this trade, and we get the Arizona's second rounder, and maybe we get a little bit more picks. It's like, well, you know what? We have the wide receivers now, but maybe we don't feel confident about it later. So maybe that's when a John Mingo, a Isovis, a Perry, a Jaden Reed pick comes into play at wide receiver, and same thing for corner. It's like another thing I didn't mention is that the Ravens might have a handshake agreement in place before the draft with cornerback Rock Ya-Sin,
Mm-hmm.
former Oakland Raiders quarterback, and he'd be a really solid number 2 corner beside Marlon Humphrey. And maybe like that is where you take the pick on Mikai Blackman or Jacorian Bennett or your guy Caillou Blue Kelly or Travis Hodges Tomlinson. It's like maybe that's where you take that hit. And again, like that's where I think the value of the class is there. I think the the less the most the least valuable I think is that quarterback. I think if it's not Dorian Thompson Robinson, I really don't even want him. I don't want anything to do with Sensen Bennett. I don't know about you. I just don't. I just don't like it. Like he got kicked out of the Senior Bowl for drunk driving. So like maybe that's just not even like it's like the Ravens aren't even going to touch that.
Yeah, I mean
Thankfully,
that's a
maybe
big thing for the Ravens is those character concerns. They're known for taking guys completely off their board. That being said, the Monken connection's undeniable. Bennett's growth, Monken's ability to use Bennett is really undeniable. We saw how much better Georgia's offense got in the last year. After their first championship season, we saw how much better Bennett looked and how he was able to use his. Monken was able to get him to use his legs both in schemed runs and scrambles. I don't hate it as much as you do. I think it's the kind of, sixth round dice roll I want to take if he slips down there, but certainly plenty to answer about those character questions that, the Ravens typically do not have too much tolerance for. That's one that a lot of people are predicting just because of Monken and the fact that we need a cheaper backup quarterback for the future. But I do agree with you. I think DTR is really the guy that I'd prefer the most. You could even say I'm DTF with DTR. And I think that's about where we should end this podcast. Jared, thanks so much for joining me today. And we'll definitely have you back on the podcast in the future after the draft.
thank you, Nikhil.